All right, welcome to part 3. Where did the Book of Mormon come from? As we seek to explore a further investigation of this question. So, if you'll remember in our last video, we began with this man. His name was Solomon Spaulding. We know that he died in 1816. We know he was born in 1761. And the questions we were asking about was who copied and or stole his manuscript? What happened to the manuscript? And in order to answer these questions, we have to connect the dots. We got to keep on connecting, just like a detective who will basically are putting together a jigsaw puzzle. If I may put it that way, I like putting together jigsaw puzzles, and then you get the bigger picture. So Spaulding died, as we said, in 1816, and the Book of Mormon was published in 1830. So there's this 14-year gap. That's a very important years, as we'll see later on. But we see after the Book of Mormon came out, LDS missionaries are going out spreading the word, and they converted a man named D.P. Holbert in 1833. So that's 3 years after the Book of Mormon was published. Now, just to know a little bit about D.P. Holbert, he was born February 3rd, 1809, as you can see here in Vermont. He moved several places westward from 1809 to 1833, and it was believed in February of 1833 that he was converted to the LDS faith. So about a month later, he was made an elder at Kirtland, Ohio. And so mid-March, he went on a mission eastward. And then mid-April, he preached near Jacksonville or Albion, Pennsylvania, a strong possibility where Holbert first heard about Solomon Spaulding's writings, but that's speculation on my part and other writers that I did some research from. So while on this mission, it is a strong probability that he did have unlawful relations with females. He returned to Kirtland, Ohio, and on June 3rd, Hyde, his partner, made charges against Holbert about his unlawful conduct. Mid-June 1833, Holbert petitioned for a retrial. June 22nd was charged again with unlawful conduct. On June 23rd, after the hearing, he was cut off from the church again. And then in July 1833, he started holding public lectures against the LDS faith. So on June 24th, he returned to Springfield, Pennsylvania, and began holding some public lectures against the LDS faith there, around that area. And the area I'm speaking about is somewhere what we call West Springfield. So here's Kirtland, Ohio, and then there's this area up here on what we call the Western Reserve. After that area, he went to Albion, Pennsylvania, or the Jackson settlement, where it's highly probable he met a Mr. Jackson, and that's possibly a Lyman Jackson. May have been July 1833. We're not for certain, though. So this area, and then he went to Albion, Pennsylvania. Now, Benjamin Winchester, he's a Latter-day Saint writer, and he's wrote a book called The Origin of the Spaulding Theory, and on page 8 he says, during the 6 or 8 months, or in fact it's actually 4 to 6 months, and this is what I gathered from other researchers, that Mr. Holbert was preaching in the state of Pennsylvania. Part of the time he belonged to the church, part of it he was lecturing against it. He formed a large circle of acquaintance, mingled with all sorts and classes of people. On a small village called the Jackson Settlement, a place that's famous for its infidels, he became familiar with a family of the name of Jackson and others who were personally acquainted with the now celebrated Solomon Spaulding, who is reputed to be the legitimate author of the Book of Mormon. Then he writes on and says, here, while in conversation with him, Mr. Holbert learned that Mr. Spaulding, while alive, wrote a work called The Manuscript Found. Not any of these persons had the most distant idea that this novel had ever been converted into the Book of Mormon, or that there was any connection between them. Indeed, Mr. Jackson, who had read both the Book of Mormon and Spaulding's manuscript, told Mr. Holbert when he came to get a signature to a writing testifying to the probability that Mr. Spaulding's manuscript had been converted into the Book of Mormon, that there was no agreement between them, for said he, Mr. Spaulding's manuscript was a very small work, in the form of a novel saying not one word about the children of Israel. Now notice this. But professed to give an account of a race of people who originated from the Romans, while Mr. Spalding said he had translated from a Latin parchment that he had found. Now, the reason I bring this up is obviously at some point in time, Mr. Spalding had allowed Mr. Jackson to read his first manuscript. And that's why when Hulbert came to Mr. Jackson, he says, listen, is there a connection between the Book of Mormon and Solomon Spalding's manuscript found? Well, I mean, Lyman Jackson, he's being an honest witness. He knew about the first manuscript, but not the second one. And that's very important when we think about what's being said here. So he goes on to say, the Book of Mormon, he added, purports to be written by a branch of the house of Israel. It's written in a different style and altogether different. For this reason, Mr. Jackson refused to lend his name to the lie and expresses indignation and contempt at the base and wicked project used to deceive the public. Mr. Jackson was a good man, a good citizen. After hearing that such a novel had been written, Mr. Hulbert, in order to carry out his designs, resolved to make this fact the foundation of a notorious fabrication, at the same time make it appear as plausible as possible to deceive the world and induce them to account for the origin of the Book of Mormon in some other way than the truth. Now, this is where we see Winchester's opinion coming into the mix. And so, that's the goal, is to try to prove Hulbert is the originator of the Spalding theory, as state here in this next slide. Winchester's writing from the perspective that Hulbert was the originator of this theory. But we will see this is not true later on. Jackson was able to remember the first manuscript, as I was telling you, the manuscript story, the Conduit Creek, the Roman story. So, and we will show evidence that there are to be shown for 2 or more manuscripts later. And the main point to understand is that Hulbert heard a connection about Spalding's writings. Hulbert may have learned to see the Spaldings in Conduitville from Jackson himself, and Hulbert may also have heard about those who lived in Conduit from Jackson. But those are speculations. We're not certain, but somehow he came to know about these witnesses. So Albion, Pennsylvania, we know he traveled, and he traveled to Conduitville, Pennsylvania. And Hulbert met the Spaldings, and the first 2 witnesses were John and Martha Spalding, Solomon's brother and sister-in-law. So that's where that's located there. Should give you an idea. Now, before we look at the witness statements, we must always ask 4 questions for a reliable eyewitness testimony. Were they present? What I mean is, were they at the right time and place to have heard or read Spalding's manuscript? 2, were they corroborated? Meaning, is there additional support to back up what they were saying? 3, were they accurate? What did they say, and how well were their words preserved? What about their details? Were they correct? Were they consistent with one another? Now, and the 4th question is on this next slide. Just to let you know. So, we think about, were they present? Were they corroborated? Were they accurate? 4, were they biased? What would be their ulterior motive for lying? Was there overwhelming prejudice on their part? Now, these 4 questions I derived from a book called Cold Case Christianity, written by J. Warner Wallace, who is in fact a detective, and I think he does a good job. And I've done another series of videos where I explore, showing, as J. Warner Wallace did, how the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were indeed reliable eyewitnesses. And they passed these questions with flying colors. They were present with Jesus. They were corroborated by archaeology and many other things. I would just ask you to check out the video. Were they accurate in what they said? Were they biased? I mean, what was their motive? So I really ask you to look at those to see that. And we're going to use the same test with the eyewitnesses for Spalding's manuscript found. So what I want you to take note is I'll be using this color code system of red, purple, blue, and green for the 4-part witness test ahead. So we see that Hulbert did write down the testimony of John Spalding, who was Solomon Spalding's brother. Yeah. So here's what John Spalding said. Solomon Spalding was born in Ashford, Connecticut in 1761 and in early life contracted a taste for literary pursuits. After he left school, he entered Plainfield Academy, where he made great proficiency in study and excelled most of his classmates. He next commenced the study of law in Windham County, in which he made little progress, having in the meantime turned his attention to religious subjects. He soon after entered Dartmouth College, with the intention of qualifying himself for the ministry, where he obtained the degree of A.M. and was afterwards regularly ordained. After preaching 3 or 4 years, he gave it up, removed to Cherry Valley, New York, commenced the mercantile business in company with his brother, Josiah. In a few years, he failed in business, and in the year 1809, removed to Conneaut in Ohio. The year following, I removed to Ohio and found him engaged in building a forge. I made him a visit, and about 3 years after, found that he had failed and considerably involved in debt. So as you can see, he knew quite a bit about his brother's life, didn't he? And we've pointed that out in early videos. He then told me how he had been writing a book, which he intended to have printed, the avails of which he thought would enable him to pay all of his debts. The book was entitled The Manuscript Found, of which he read to me many passages. It was an historical romance of the first settlers of America, endeavoring to show that the American Indians are the descendants of the Jews of the lost tribes. He gave a detailed account of their journey from Jerusalem by land and sea, till they arrived in America under the command of Nephi and Lehi. They afterwards had quarrels and contentions and were separated into 2 distinct nations, one of which he denominated Nephites and the other Lamanites. Cruel and bloody wars ensued, in which great multitudes were slain. They buried their dead in large heaps, which caused the mounds so common in this country. Their arts, sciences, and civilization were brought into view in order to account for all the curious antiquities found in various parts of North and South America. So as you can see, quite a few details that do fit the plot line of the Book of Mormon. I have recently read the Book of Mormon, and to my great surprise, I find nearly the same historical matter, names, and as they were in my brother's writings. I will remember that he wrote in the old style, and commenced about every sentence with, and it came to pass, or now it came to pass, the same as in the Book of Mormon, and according to the best of my recollection and belief, it is the same as my brother Solomon wrote, with the exception of the religious matter. By what means it has fallen into the hands of Joseph Smith, Jr., I'm unable to determine. John Spalding. So you can see the details, quite a few details that are there. And then Martha, his wife, she says this. I was personally acquainted with Solomon Spalding about 20 years ago. I was at his house a short time before he left Conneaut. He was writing a historical novel founded upon the first settlers of America. He represented them as an enlightened and warlike people. He had for many years contended that the Aborigines of America were the descendants of some of the lost tribes of Israel, and this idea he carried out in the book in question. The lapse of time which has intervened prevents my recollecting but few of the leading incidents of his writings, but the names of Nephi and Lehi are yet fresh in my memory as being the principal heroes of his tale. They were officers of the company which first came off from Jerusalem. He gave a particular account of their journey by land and sea, till they arrived in America, after which disputes arose between the chiefs, which caused them to separate into 2 different lands, one of which was called Lamanites and the other Nephites. She makes a good point there of just showing the details of the plotline of the Book of Mormon. Once again, they match. Between these were recounted tremendous battles which frequently covered the ground with the slain, and their being buried in large heaps was the cause of the numerous mounds in the country. Some of these people he represented as being very large. I have read the Book of Mormon, which has brought fresh to my recollection the writings of Solomon Spalding, and I have no manner of doubt that the historical part of it is the same that I read and heard read more than 20 years ago. The old obsolete style and the phrases of it came to pass and are the same. Martha Spalding. So when we look at D.P. Hulbert, what he did was he left Conneautville Pennsylvania, and you journey toward Conneaut, Ohio, where Solomon Spaulding once lived. So here on the map, you can see where that's located. So just give you an idea. Obviously, what had happened was John and Martha Spaulding probably told him to journey there for similar testimonies, is what is the strong possibility. So Oliver Smith, he was a resident of Conneaut, Ohio. He was acquainted with Solomon Spaulding. In fact, as you'll see in his testimony, he stayed with Solomon Spaulding stayed with him for a while. So Hobart took his statement down. When Solomon Spaulding first came to this place, he purchased a tract of land, surveyed it out, and commenced selling it. While engaged in this business, he boarded at my house in all nearly 6 months. All his leisure hours were occupied in writing a historical novel founded upon the first settlers of this country. He said he intended to trace their journey from Jerusalem by land and sea to their arrival in America, give an account of their art, sciences, civilization, wars, and contentions. In this way, he would give a satisfactory account of all the old mounds so common to this country. During the time he was at my house, I read 100 pages or more. That's quite a bit, isn't it? Quite a big number there. Nephi and Lehi were by him represented as leading characters when they first started for America. Their main object was to escape the judgments which they supposed were coming upon the old world. But no religious matter was introduced, as I now recollect. But just before he left this place, Spaulding sent for me to call on him, which I did. He then said that although he was in my debt, he intended to leave the country and hoped I would not prevent him. For, says he, you know that I have been writing the history of the first settlement of America, and I intend to go to Pittsburgh and there live a retired life till I have completed the work, and when it is printed, it will bring me a fine sum of money, which will enable me to return and pay off all my debts. The book, you know, will sell, as everyone is anxious to learn something upon that subject. This was the last I heard of Spaulding or his book, until the Book of Mormon came into the neighborhood. When I heard the historical part of it related, I at once said it was the writings of old Solomon Spaulding. Soon after I obtained the book, and on reading it, found much of it the same as Spaulding had written more than 20 years before. Oliver Smith. Then Nahum Howard. He was also a resident of Conneaut, Ohio, and he was acquainted with Solomon Spaulding. And so we know that Hobart took down his statement. He says, I first became acquainted with Solomon Spaulding in December 1810, and after that time, I frequently saw him at his house and also at my house. I once in conversation with him expressed a surprise at not having any account of the inhabitants once in this country, who erected the old forts, mounds. He then told me that he was writing a history of that race of people, and afterwards frequently showed me his writings, which I read. I have lately read the Book of Mormon and believe it to be the same as Spaulding wrote, except the religious part. He told me that he intended to get his writings published in Pittsburgh, and he thought that in 1 century from that time it would be believed as much as any other history. Well, Spaulding was right on that, wasn't he? Because many Latter-day Saints continue to believe that that history actually occurred. Aaron Wright, in August 1833, who was also a resident of Conneaut, Ohio, and acquainted with Solomon Spaulding, he says this, I first became acquainted with Solomon Spaulding in 1808 or 1809 when he commenced building a forge on Conneaut Creek. When at his house, one day he showed and read to me a history he was writing of the lost tribes of Israel, purporting that they were the first settlers of America and that the Indians were their descendants. Upon this subject we had frequent conversations. He traced their journey from Jerusalem to America, as is given in the Book of Mormon, excepting the religious matter. The historical part of the Book of Mormon I know to be the same as I had read and heard read from the writings of Spaulding more than 20 years ago. The names more especially are the same, without any alteration. He told me his object was to account for all the fortifications and to be found in this country, and said that in time it would be fully believed by all except learned men and historians. I once anticipated reading his writings in print, but little expected to see them in a new Bible. Spaulding had many other manuscripts, which I expect to see when Smith translates his other plate. In conclusion, I will observe that the names of and most of the historical part of the Book of Mormon were as familiar to me before I read it as most modern history. If it is not Spalding's writing, it is the same as he wrote. And if Smith was inspired, I think it was by the same spirit that Spalding was, which he confessed to be the love of money. Aaron Wright. Then we see, after he takes down those witness statements in late August of 1833, he wanted to do some more public lectures against the LDS faith, and he thought he might gain more support, and a committee sponsored him. And we see that he actually, September 18th, 1833, he returned to Collingwood, Ohio, and he was introduced to even more witnesses who testified of the same facts. So, what did those witnesses have to say about the matter? Well, please join me next time in our next upcoming video on that matter. Thank you for watching and listening.